Hello, my name is Christine Cray, and the title of this presentation is The Racialization of Food, Indian Corn, Disgust, and the Development of Underdevelopment in Depression-Era British Honduras. All Belizeans will have learned about this first part. In 1934, when global demand for mahogany had crashed, thousands of men in British Honduras found themselves unemployed, and many in the colony faced starvation. In Belize City, hundreds stood in line for government distributions of rice gruel mixed with sugar, and then worked in unemployment relief for 5 cents a day, breaking up rocks for construction of the Northern Road. Antonio Soberanis Gomez delivered speeches calling for the formation of a union, and a crowd of 500, calling themselves the Laborers and Unemployed Association, marched on and shut down the sawmill and lumber yard of BEPCO, the Belize Estate and Produce Company. This marked the beginning of the labor movement in the colony. At the same time, though, Maya agricultural food production continued apace throughout the colony. 8,000 tons of corn were produced a year. So here's my question. Why was there starvation in Belize City when so much corn was available? Essentially, why was there not a robust food network bringing local foods to markets in Belize City? It's complicated, but at root, the problem was a British conception of race. In the 19th century, various British writers developed a way of talking about different groups of people that fused race and culture. In British Honduran writings by missionaries, travelers, and colonial administrators, each racial type consisted of a bundle of physical features, a certain constitution, a moral character, and customary food habits, which held it all together. The Maya were associated with corn, which was called Indian corn, and it became a potent symbol of Indianness. In colonialist writings, corn dishes were regarded as disgusting and a cause of Indian weakness and mortality. The close textual association of Indians and corn is such that visceral expressions of disgust for corn read as disgust for Indians. Corn thus became racialized. British aversion to maize dates back to the earliest English settlements in the Americas. According to Vester, quote, the first inhabitants of Jamestown would not eat corn, even when faced with the prospect of starving, since they associated it with savagery and feared for their humanity. Corn was dismissed as fit only for feeding animals. I want to give you an example of the British Honduran racialization of corn. In an 1867 letter, Methodist missionary Richard Fletcher described the Maya to his superiors in London. He began with a moral characterization, calling them, quote, diminished, degraded, and miserable inhabitants, end quote. His description moved quickly from house form and furnishings to cooking techniques and then to the following, quote, the food in common use among the Indians is very soon told. They chiefly subsist on cornbread, which they dip into a kind of soup made of ground pumpkin seeds and chili, or bean soup and chili. They seldom buy meat or kill a chicken or even make use of eggs, so that their food is not very nutritive, end quote. Moving on to crop cultivation techniques, he then proceeded to list common sins, and in the same paragraph he added, quote, with few exceptions, they grow up with large, hard bowels, the consequence of the indigestible food they eat, end quote. The juxtaposition of sin and repulsive food is telling. Interested in phenology, the missionaries sketched and detailed their physical appearance, including such minutiae as the roundness of the head, the slope of the chin, the thickness of the hair, and the angle of the toes. He offered this interpretation, quote, according to phrenology, benevolence and the intellectual faculties are not very largely developed, but destructiveness and secrecy are, end quote. From this condemnation of their intrinsic moral character, he explained that, quote, they are not long-lived. Their constitution is early broken up, and they pass away before they have lived out half their days, end quote. His outlook was not optimistic. Quote, unless God in his providence interposes on their behalf, Spaniards and Indians within the next 50 years will nearly all have passed away, end quote. Again, physical appearance, diet, vitality, and morality were fused into one racial type. As Richard Wilk has discussed, the early Baymen in Belize had little interest in corn. They preferred wheat flour and meat. They imported these foods and also fed them to their enslaved African workers, the famous rations of 7 and 4. I've scoured British plans for colonial economic development from the early 19th century to the mid-20th century. They devised schemes for stimulating export-oriented production of all kinds of crops, fruit, and other forest products, but none of these writers ever expressed interest in developing corn as a commodity. They wanted to continue eating their imported wheat flour and other foods, and so long as there was an export market for Belizean timber, they could purchase and eat what they wanted. Okay, we've discussed the British colonialists, but what about the Creoles? Creoles became familiar with Maya food and culinary habits at the logging camps. I conducted interviews with Maya elders who had lived in San Jose in the northwestern quadrant in the 1930s, where Bepco logging was concentrated at the time. The elders told me that at that time their families engaged in a brisk trade with the Creole workers, selling their many agricultural products, fish, and game meat to them, or trading for a portion of the woodcutters' rations. However, the Maya families did not trade or sell corn to the Creole workers. It seems that the Creoles had inherited the British antipathy for corn. One colonial British officer in 1939 stated flatly that, quote, a kind of dietetic snobbery has thus been evolved. Given British and Creole disinterest in corn, and to be more precise, British disgust for corn, a domestic market for corn never developed. The Maya were fully engaged in the money economy, working for wages and selling some of their produce, but nearly all the corn they grew was for consumption within the household. In the midst of the Depression, this colonial culinary system fell apart. Even as early as 1930, the Belize Estate and Produce Company, the largest mahogany company in the colony by far, indicated that, quote, the market for mahogany logs was characterized by unrelieved gloom. Throughout the whole period, there was an entire lack of anything approaching activity in demand. Belize's deadliest hurricane struck the capital in 1931, further crippling mahogany output. Workers were laid off and returned to their homes in Belize City. The Creoles had no tradition of farming because they had worked as woodcutters for so long, and they prided themselves on that work. In 1934, hunger set in and famine was imminent. Although the Maya continued their farming, there was no infrastructure to get their corn and other produce to Belize City. And besides, they were not in the habit of growing surplus corn because there had never been market demand for that. The newly appointed governor, Alan Burns, set out to try to solve the problem of hunger. He planned to bring in Jamaicans, who had a strong tradition of farming. Crown land grants were provided for those who wanted to grow their own food. A new Board of Agriculture began to purchase basic crops, rice, corn, and beans at guaranteed prices, and a government marketing board opened. The board purchasing plan had fatal flaws, though. Purchasing stations were established in Belize City and Punta Gorda, but none in the western region where the greatest number of Maya farmers lived. What's worse, the board purchasing prices offered for corn and beans were lower than the costs of production and transport. Maya families would have lost money by producing surpluses of those crops. 4 years later, domestic food production was still insufficient, and the governor continued devising schemes to stimulate it. He tried almost anything other than offering higher prices for corn and beans. After a 7-year period, a government-appointed committee reviewed domestic food production, and they were very plain that the board would need to offer higher prices for staple crops. Although the financial disincentive for producing surplus corn and beans was clear enough, perhaps out of habit, the committee could not resist blaming local cultures and customs. A cultural attitudinal shift was needed, they asserted, quote, "He, the local planter, must be encouraged to develop the communal spirit which will assist his agricultural efforts and his welfare." If the colonialists were honest with themselves, they might have asked about the systemic factors that had suppressed local food production for at least a century by that time. That might have forced them, though, to come to grips with how corn had become racialized and how their own dietary tastes and aversions had marginalized Maya food production. Thank you.